I got a call at 3 a.m. that changed everything forever. My son's voice trembled on the other end of the line. "Mom, I need to tell you something." My heart raced. At 62, I've lived long enough to know when something is wrong. Very wrong. "I got married, Mom. Yesterday." The silence that followed was like a blade slicing through the air. "I got married. Yesterday. Without me. Without any of my family. Without even a phone call beforehand. My only son, whom I raised alone after his father abandoned us, had just excluded me from the most important day of his life. Why, Roberto? Why did you hide this from me?" His answer chilled me to the bone. "She thought it was best, Mom. You know how you are. What am I like? What kind of mother had I been to deserve this? I dedicated 30 years of my life to this boy. I worked double shifts as a cleaner in 3 different homes, gave up my dreams of studying nursing, and faced scornful looks and nasty comments to give him everything I never had. I paid for private school English classes and engineering school. Also, he could have the opportunities one was denied. And now I discovered that a woman I barely knew had more influence over him than I did. A woman who had appeared in his life only 8 months earlier, and had already managed to convince him that his own mother didn't deserve to be present at the wedding. I put the phone down and sat there in the darkness of my living room, feeling the weight of decades of sacrifice morph into a pain I hadn't even known existed. But that call was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, I discovered that the secret marriage was just the tip of the iceberg. There were much darker secrets hidden within that decision. And when I finally discovered the truth behind it all, I understood that sometimes the greatest betrayal comes from the very people we least expect. The question that won't leave my mind is, do we really know the people we love? In the days that followed, I tried to process what had happened. How could a mother who had dedicated her entire life to her son be considered a problem on his wedding day? I wondered if I had truly been such a bad mother, if my care, my love, my constant presence had become a burden to him. I began to reminisce about the past few months. Roberto had changed. Visits became more rare, conversations shorter, always hurried. When I asked about his girlfriend, he'd changed the subject. "You'll get to know each other better in the future, Mom." What future? Now I understood there was no future plan for me in his life. For years, I imagined what my son's wedding would be like. I saw myself helping choose the venue, meeting the bride's family, maybe even helping with the preparations. I dreamed of wearing that blue dress I'd saved especially for special occasions. I imagined the photos, the hugs, the emotion of seeing my happy boy by my side. Instead, I found out everything through a late-night connection, as if it were bad news that is announced at the worst possible time to make less of an impact. I began to understand why so many people choose to stay here, following each unfolding of these stories. Because the pain of family exclusion is something that goes far beyond words. It's a wound that bleeds silently, that makes us question our worth as people, as mothers, as women. But as the days passed, I began to notice strange details in the few conversations we had after the wedding. Stray comments, half-words, a nervousness that didn't match the happiness of a newlywed. Roberto was hiding something much bigger than a simple secret wedding. The first clue arrived 3 weeks after the wedding. Roberto showed up at my house unannounced, something he hadn't done in months. He was pale with dark circles under his eyes, his hands trembling slightly as he took the cup of coffee I offered. "Mom, do you have those old family documents? Certificates, grandpa's papers, that kind of thing?" I found the question strange. Why would a newlywed need old family documents? Especially someone who had just excluded me from the most important ceremony of his life. "What do you want this for, son?" He looked away, staring out the window as if searching the backyard for an answer. "Yeah. It's for some wedding formalities. Bureaucratic paperwork." But I'd known my son for 30 years. I knew exactly how he looked when he lied. The same way he'd looked when he was a child and broke something at home. His tense shoulders, his strained voice, that fleeting look that always betrayed his little mischief. I went up to my room and brought out the shoebox where I kept all the family documents. My father's birth certificate, my grandfather's, some old farm deeds we lost when I was young. Roberto leafed through everything with an urgency that startled me, photographed some papers with his cell phone, and ran out, barely saying goodbye. That night I couldn't sleep. There was something deeply wrong with the situation. Weddings don't require documents from deceased grandparents. They don't require this desperate rush, this anguish on the faces of those who should be enjoying their honeymoon. I began to piece together the pieces. The secret marriage, the family's exclusion, the urgent search for old documents, the wife I barely knew, who appeared out of nowhere and in just a few months managed to isolate my son from all of us. A blonde, light-eyed woman who spoke of our family as if we were an inconvenience that needed to be dealt with. I remembered a comment she'd made the only time she'd been to my house. "Wow, that's such an interesting story about your grandfather's farm. It must have been a considerable asset, right?" At the time I thought it was just curiosity. Now I was beginning to understand that perhaps it was something very different. What was happening wasn't about love or privacy. It was about something much more calculated, much darker. And for the first time since that late-night phone call, I felt like maybe I wasn't just the victim in this story. I decided to investigate on my own. I couldn't just accept that my son had turned into a stranger overnight. Something or someone was behind this radical change. I started discreetly. I called his cousin, Carla, who had always been close to Roberto. She was also intrigued by his sudden marriage. "Auntie, he didn't even tell me he was in a serious relationship. The last time we spoke, he said he was single and focused on work." This caught my attention. Roberto has always been one to share his achievements, especially with his family. When he got the job at the engineering firm, he called all his relatives. When he bought the apartment, he made a point of showing me every room. Why would he hide a serious relationship? I decided to stop by his company. Not to embarrass him, but to better understand this new reality. I spoke with the receptionist, a friendly woman who always greeted me when I visited Roberto at work. "Dona Maria, it's so good to see you. I heard that Roberto got married." What a surprise, right? We didn't even know he was dating. Yet another confirmation. Not even their co-workers knew about the relationship. How could someone hide such an intense passion that resulted in marriage in just 8 months? That night, sitting in my armchair, looking at Roberto's photos scattered around the room, I began to feel that I wasn't alone in this strangeness. It's at this point that many feel the urge to support this journey, leaving a silent signal that the message has touched them, because they recognize that sometimes mothers need to investigate to protect their children, even when they don't realize they're in danger. I grabbed my phone and did something I never thought I would. I searched my son's new wife's full name on social media. What I discovered in the first few pages made me realize my maternal intuition was more accurate than I'd imagined. There was a pattern there, a repetition that chilled my blood. Her social media profile seemed perfect. Photos of herself in expensive restaurants, international trips, designer clothes. But when I started analyzing the dates, I discovered something disturbing. All these lavish posts began exactly 8 months ago. Before that, her profile was completely different. In older photos, she appeared in simple settings, wearing basic clothing, with no sign of the lifestyle she now displayed. And there was something more disturbing. Comments from people asking about a certain Miguel in old photos, but these comments had been deleted. All that remained were her replies saying, "I'd rather not talk about it." I decided to dig deeper. I searched Miguel's name alongside hers and found records of a previous marriage. A marriage that had been dissolved exactly 10 months earlier. Miguel was a successful businessman who had lost everything in a divorce. The local newspaper articles told a familiar story. A middle-aged man falls madly in love, marries quickly, and then discovers that half of his assets had been transferred to his wife during the marriage. My heart began to pound. The pattern was forming in my mind like pieces of a macabre puzzle. A woman who appears out of nowhere, seduces vulnerable men, marries them quickly, and then disappears with part of their possessions. But Roberto had no significant assets. The apartment was still financed, the car was basic, And his salary was good but not extraordinary. What could she possibly want with him? It was then that I remembered the documents. My grandfather's farm, the old deed. Even though it had been lost for decades, that rural property was still in the family name. And with the rise in land values in the countryside, especially with the government's new infrastructure projects, that area had become a fortune. My blood ran cold. She wasn't after Roberto's present. She was after our family's past. And my son had become merely the means to an inheritance he didn't even know existed. That night, after Roberto hurried out with the documents in hand, I sat in the armchair staring at the empty box. The sound of the door slamming still echoed inside me like a warning that something serious was brewing. The clock read 2 in the morning, and even though I was exhausted, sleep wouldn't come. With every minute, my heart raced as if to alert me that there was much more behind this sudden urgency. The room was plunged into darkness, lit only by the silvery reflection of the moon shining through the barely drawn curtain. In this cold light, memories mingled with suspicions. I saw the child he'd been, sitting on the floor playing with toy cars, and at the same time the tense man who now hid his eyes from me. It was a cruel contrast. The boy who trusted me to protect his secrets, and the adult who now seemed to be conspiring against me, even without realizing it. The silence in the house was almost suffocating. Only the creak of the wood beneath my feet as I got up to get a drink of water reminded me that I was still there, trying not to lose myself in the whirlwind of thoughts. The glass trembled in my hands, reflecting the kitchen light like a shard of glass about to shatter. I couldn't tell if I was shaking with fear or anger, but I felt something was about to break. It was strange how hope and fear could coexist in the same heart. A part of me still believed Roberto might simply be confused, manipulated by circumstances I didn't understand. But another, more bitter part already understood that there were greater forces at play. Forces that used my son as a piece on a board I was only just beginning to see. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass of the window and stared out at the moonlit backyard. The shadows of the trees moved slowly in the wind, as if dancing silently. And I knew, in that suspended moment, that the shadows inside my house were lengthening too, ready to reveal secrets that had remained hidden until then. In the following days, the lack of clear answers began to weigh heavily on my son's every gesture. He no longer called me as before, avoided staying home for long, and when he did come, he always seemed to carry an invisible rush, like someone afraid of being discovered. This change wasn't just noticeable to me. The very atmosphere of the house had transformed. The space that once held our long conversations was now a scene of clipped words and averted glances. It was in this emptiness that I began to see more clearly the impact of each action. The simple act of handing over those documents had changed the dynamic between us. As if, by opening that box of family memories, I had also opened the door to something much larger and more dangerous. It was impossible not to think about the consequences. A seemingly small choice, a gesture of trust, could set off a chain reaction that would change everything. In my mind, the image was clear. A chessboard illuminated by dim light. Each piece moved carefully, each move carrying more weight than it seemed. On one side, my son and that woman, advancing swiftly. On the other, I, watching silently, planning, but still not revealing my move. This contrast between action and reaction consumed me, yet strengthened me. Because, deep down, I knew that the game only ends when all the pieces reveal themselves. It's curious how, when sharing something like this, many people find echoes of their own experiences. Perhaps you too have felt this strangeness, this feeling that someone close to you is hiding something that could completely change your life. If this reflection awakens something in you, recording your words can be more than an answer. It can be a silent testimony that we are not alone in facing this pain. And the more I observed their movements, the clearer it became that this was no simple secret marriage. There was something larger, hidden, just waiting for the right moment to surface. I could feel this revelation approaching, like a wave growing in the distance and threatening to engulf everything when it finally reached the shore. With each encounter with Roberto, I noticed him drifting further from the person I knew. There was always a shadow in his gaze, as if he carried a secret too heavy to bear. When he spoke, his sentences were incomplete, full of awkward pauses. It was like watching someone try to hide a fire behind a thin curtain. The smoke seeped around the edges, impossible to disguise. And I, in the silence of my observation, began to realize that the consequences went beyond our bond. It was as if the plot unfolding inside my home had the power to affect the entire family memory, as if a sudden pull of a thread could unravel the entire fabric. Those documents he took were not just papers yellowed by time. They were stories, roots, scars that kept alive the memory of who we were. Now, each photograph signature, each hastily handled deed, became a piece of a larger puzzle. The contrast was inevitable. On one hand, the hope that he might yet awaken from his torpor. On the other, the challenge of facing the possibility that he was increasingly entangled in something too dangerous to control. It was like walking down a road lit only by the moon, knowing that at any moment a thick cloud could blot out all the light. The nights grew long and dense. I found myself sitting in the living room, surrounded by old photographs, feeling the weight of each gaze frozen in time. Smiles from the past reminded me of what could be lost forever. And at the same time, a premonition grew stronger. There was something in his haste, in the way she had appeared in our lives, that was no coincidence. It was impossible to ignore. The more I watched, the clearer it became that the pieces were moving too fast. As if a revelation was about to spill out, no matter how hard they tried to hide it. And I knew deep down that when that moment arrived, nothing would remain intact. What disturbed me most was not just Roberto's haste, but the lack of joy in his actions. It was as if he had lost the sparkle in his eyes, the same sparkle he'd had since childhood, when he'd run around the yard with a ball in his hands and believed the world was infinite. Now, there were only shadows, as if every word spoken was measured and every silence imposed. This change couldn't be explained solely by the secret marriage. There was something deeper gnawing away inside, and every day I felt the weight of this transformation. Contrasts haunted me. On one side, the light of memory, a boy who laughed easily, who took pride in showing me his achievements. On the other, the shadow of a man who no longer looked me in the eye, who hid documents as if they were weapons of war. This clash between past and present made me question whether there was still a way back or if the abyss had already been defined. I began to notice the details around me. The house, once filled with conversation and music, now felt muffled, as if every wall absorbed the weight of tension. Even the sound of his footsteps sounded different, harder, more hurried, like someone always late for a destination they dare not reveal. I wondered if it was fear that drove him or obedience to someone controlling him. The challenge was not to let myself be swallowed by doubt, because at the same time that I felt like believing he could still choose the light, I also realized that each new attitude pushed him deeper into the darkness. It was like watching a candle burning in the midst of a storm. The flame still held, but the gale was already swirling, threatening to extinguish it at any moment. And it was in this landscape of contrasts, between trust and distrust, hope and loss, that I realized something bigger was looming on the horizon. Like dark clouds about to break, there was a secret there that could no longer be contained. And when it came to light, I knew the impact would be so strong that it would forever change the course of our lives. It was at that point that I understood that life wasn't just giving me pain, but also a rare opportunity to see beyond appearances. With every cold gesture, every heavy silence, I wasn't just witnessing my son's estrangement, but learning to decipher the signs of a plot that went far beyond the two of us. It was like walking down a dark hallway and suddenly finding an open window, through which the dawn light insisted on streaming in, even against the will of the walls. I saw before me an immense challenge, but also a silent achievement, not allowing pain to define me. The image of the boy he had been still lived within me, and it was this memory that gave me the strength to face the man he had become. Because, in the end, the transformation wasn't just his. It was mine too. Every tear that fell on the pillow, every sleepless night, every suspicion that grew in my chest shaped me in unexpected ways. This contrast between loss and learning showed me something essential. When everything seems to be falling apart, we can still choose what to save from the rubble. And realizing this, I felt that sharing this story was more than just venting. It was a gesture of resistance. Because I know that many who follow me have also faced the weight of exclusion, betrayal, and the suffocating silence. And that's why, if this narrative touched something deep inside you, leaving your voice here, whether with a comment, a silent support, or even choosing to stay, is an act that connects and strengthens us. Today, I look back and realize that the true privilege was not just surviving the pain, but learning to transform it into clarity. Discovering that the shadow only exists because the light insists on existing as well. And it is with this certainty that I conclude this passage, not as someone who closes a story, but as someone who opens a door so that each of us, in our own way, can also find the strength to walk amid life's contradictions. Because, deep down, it is on this path that we discover who we truly are, and how much light we can still carry, even after the darkness.